High above the clouds, every flight begins in perfect harmony, calm voices, steady engines, and absolute trust. Behind the sealed cockpit door, two pilots work in sync, guiding hundreds of lives through the sky. But sometimes, that calm shatters. A single decision, a small distraction, or a moment of confusion can turn precision into chaos in seconds. Tonight, we step inside the cockpit into the world where discipline meets human fragility. These are the real stories of flights that began like any other, until everything went wrong. Stay until the end, and if you'd like to see more stories like this, consider subscribing and leaving a like. On the morning of March 24th, 2015, Germanwings Flight 9525 departed from Barcelona, Spain, bound for Düsseldorf, Germany. It was a routine flight, a short hop over the French Alps, just 2 hours long, operated by an Airbus A320. The sky was calm, the air clear. 150 people were on board: families, students, professionals, and crew. For most of them, it was just another day in the air. Inside the cockpit sat Captain Patrick Sondenheimer, an experienced pilot with more than 6,000 hours of flight time, and First Officer Andreas Lubitz, who had recently joined the airline after a period of medical leave. Their early communication with air traffic control was normal. The flight climbed smoothly through the morning light, reaching its cruising altitude of 38,000 feet. Passengers fastened their seatbelts loosely. The crew began their service, and the rhythm of a routine flight unfolded predictable, calm, and controlled. But in aviation, silence can sometimes be more telling than sound. At 9:30, just over 30 minutes after takeoff, the captain spoke briefly to the first officer. "You have the controls," he said, before leaving the cockpit to use the restroom. The sound of the cockpit door closing was captured by the flight recorder, a small, almost insignificant moment that would later become the key to understanding one of the darkest chapters in modern aviation. Moments later, the autopilot was adjusted. The altitude setting changed from 38,000 feet down to 100 feet above sea level. The aircraft began a controlled descent, quiet, deliberate, and precise. There was no radio call, no distress signal, no acknowledgement from the first officer. The aircraft's descent path followed the terrain of the French Alps below, descending at a steady rate of 3,500 feet per minute. Outside the locked cockpit door, Captain Sondenheimer returned. He called out to his co-pilot. No response. He knocked, then shouted. Still nothing. In the cabin, flight attendants began to realize something was wrong. Passengers may have looked out the windows to see mountain peaks growing larger beneath them, unaware that no one was in control of the descent. On the cockpit voice recorder, the captain's desperate attempts to open the reinforced door are audible banging, shouting, pleading. The first officer's breathing, calm and steady, continues throughout. No words, no emotion, just the sound of controlled descent. At 10:41 a.m., after 8 minutes of steady descent, the aircraft struck the side of a mountain near Seine-les-Alpes in southern France. The impact was instantaneous. There were no survivors. When French investigators from the BEA, the Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis, arrived at the scene, they found fragments of the Airbus scattered across steep, snow-covered terrain. Recovery was painstaking. But from the wreckage, they recovered the two black boxes, the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder. The evidence they contained told a story not of mechanical failure, but of the human mind. The BEA's final report concluded that the first officer had deliberately initiated the descent while the captain was locked out. Further investigation revealed that Andreas Lubitz had been declared unfit for flying by several doctors due to severe depression. Yet these medical evaluations had never been fully communicated to the airline. The system designed to protect passengers had been defeated by confidentiality and silence. After the crash, the world was shaken not just by the loss of life, but by the realization that the greatest threat to aviation safety might come from within the cockpit itself. Airlines and regulators around the world began to change procedures. One immediate rule followed. At least 2 authorized crew members must always be present in the cockpit. Psychologists were brought into aviation safety discussions for the first time in decades. But for many, the haunting question remained: how could something so deliberate happen inside one of the most regulated environments in the world? Experts in aviation psychology called it the dark side of trust. Pilots are trained to handle mechanical failures, weather, and emergencies, but no one is trained to face the collapse of a colleague's mind. The locked cockpit door, once a symbol of post-2001 security, had now become an unbreakable barrier between life and death. In the years that followed, documentaries, reports, and studies tried to piece together Lubitz's final hours. He had rehearsed the descent days earlier during a solo portion of another flight. He had searched online for suicide methods. He had received a doctor's note excusing him from work, a note he tore up before leaving for duty. The tragedy of Germanwings Flight 9525 was not about one man's illness, nor just one airline's failure. It was about the limits of how far we can go to predict human behavior, and how vulnerable the human element remains even in an age of automation. Today, when pilots brief before a flight, they speak not only of weather and fuel, but also of well-being. Mental health awareness has become an integral part of flight safety training. It is one of the few legacies born from that day, a legacy written in the hope that such silence, such loss, will never echo again through the mountains of southern France. The world of aviation will always chase perfection, but it will never be immune to the complexity of the human mind. And that is what makes this story both haunting and unforgettable. In the early hours of October 31st, 1999, New York's JFK Airport was alive with movement. The night was calm, engines roared in the distance, and inside Terminal 1, EgyptAir Flight 990 was preparing for departure. The aircraft was a Boeing 767, a trusted wide-body jet, scheduled to carry 217 souls across the Atlantic to Cairo. For many passengers, it was the end of a long visit to America. For others, it was a return home, a crossing between continents, between night and dawn. At 1:50 in the morning, the jet lifted off from runway 22 right. It climbed steadily, disappearing into the dark, moonlit sky. Inside the cockpit sat Captain Ahmed El-Habashi, an experienced pilot and instructor, alongside First Officer Gamil Al-Batouti, who was nearing retirement. Both men had logged thousands of hours of flight time. The aircraft climbed through the quiet layers of air, and at 33,000 feet, leveled off for cruise. The cabin lights dimmed. Passengers settled in. For a moment, everything was as it should be. But as the minutes passed, a subtle shift began to unfold, one that would only later be understood through the haunting playback of the cockpit voice recorder. The captain spoke briefly to his first officer, telling him he was going to the restroom. His footsteps faded, the door closed, and the flight deck was left in silence. Then came a quiet voice, First Officer Al-Batouti's, calm, rhythmic, deliberate. He uttered the words, "Tawakkaltu ala Allah, I put my trust in God." The phrase was repeated several times, soft but firm, like a mantra. Then the sound of levers moving. The throttles pulled back. The nose began to pitch downward. The Boeing's altitude dropped sharply. From 33,000 feet, the descent rate climbed past 20,000 feet per minute. Warnings blared in the cockpit: overspeed, stall, terrain. In the cabin, passengers would have felt weightless, their stomachs lifting as the aircraft dove toward the Atlantic. Suddenly, the cockpit door burst open. The captain's voice shouted, "What's happening? What's going on?" He fought to pull the controls back. For a brief moment, the jet's descent slowed, the nose lifted, engines surged, and then, once again, the control column was pushed forward. At 2:02 a.m., EgyptAir Flight 990 disappeared from radar. The final altitude readout, 0. The Atlantic consumed everything. When rescue teams reached the crash site 200 kilometers south of Nantucket Island, they found only fragments, scattered debris, floating luggage, and oil slicks on the surface of the sea. There were no survivors. The investigation that followed would become one of the most controversial in aviation history. The U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, led the inquiry, working alongside Egypt's Civil Aviation Authority. known as the ECAA. Both agencies recovered the black boxes, the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, and both reached conclusions that could not have been more different. The NTSB's data told a grim story. There was no evidence of mechanical failure. The engines responded normally. The control surfaces worked as designed. Every change in the aircraft's path came from manual input. The NTSB concluded that the first officer had deliberately caused the crash. But Egypt refused to accept this finding. The ECAA's own report suggested that a malfunction in the elevator control system might have led to a sudden and uncontrollable descent. They argued that the phrase, "I put my trust in God," was misinterpreted, that it reflected faith in crisis, not intent. The disagreement became political. In the United States, newspapers published leaked details of the cockpit recording, sparking debates about mental health, cultural misunderstanding, and the difficulty of investigating tragedies that crossed national pride. In Cairo, officials accused Washington of bias, refusing to label one of their senior pilots as the cause. Years later, even after the final NTSB report was published, Egypt maintained its stance. The true cause, they said, was mechanical. The mystery of why the first officer acted as he did, or whether he did at all, remains unsolved. Behind the controversy lies a deeper tragedy, one that goes beyond the mechanics of flight. It is the story of how a moment of silence can divide two nations, how a single cockpit can become a stage for misunderstanding, and how the truth sometimes drowns with the wreckage. In aviation circles, Flight 990 is remembered as more than just an accident. It is a symbol of how complex human factors, culture, emotion, and pride can shape the way we interpret disaster. To this day, pilots still whisper the phrase "Tawakkaltu ala Allah" with a mix of reverence and unease. To some, it is a prayer. To others, a chilling echo from the depths of the Atlantic, a reminder that faith and fear can sometimes sound the same inside a falling plane. December 19th, 1997. A calm afternoon in Jakarta, Indonesia. SilkAir Flight 185, a Boeing 737, prepared for departure to Singapore. A short, routine flight lasting just over an hour. On board were 104 people. The flight was commanded by Captain Tsu Wei Ming, an experienced pilot with more than 7,000 hours of flight time and a former Singaporean Air Force officer. His first officer, Duncan Ward, was a young but capable Australian pilot. Both men were professionals, calm, disciplined, respected by their peers. At 3:37 p.m., the aircraft took off from Jakarta's Soekarno-Hatta International Airport. It climbed into the bright Indonesian sky, turning toward the north. For 30 minutes, everything appeared perfectly normal. The Boeing leveled off at 35,000 feet, cruising smoothly toward Singapore. The cockpit voice recorder captured the pilots chatting casually about flight schedules, weather, and their personal lives. Nothing out of the ordinary. But what happened next would become one of aviation's most unsettling mysteries, an event where silence spoke louder than anything else. At 3:51 p.m., the cockpit voice recorder suddenly stopped recording. The flight data recorder, which monitored altitude, speed, and control inputs, shut down just seconds later. Both systems were wired to separate circuit breakers located behind the captain's seat. The chances of both failing simultaneously by accident were almost impossible. Then, radar controllers in Jakarta watched in disbelief as SilkAir 185, cruising steadily moments before, began to plummet. The descent was rapid, faster than almost any Boeing 737 had ever fallen before. Within seconds, the aircraft's speed exceeded the limits of its structure. At supersonic velocity, it broke apart in midair, scattering debris across the Musi River near Palembang, in southern Sumatra. There were no survivors. When investigators from the Indonesian National Transportation Safety Committee, the NTSC, arrived, they faced a nearly impossible task. The wreckage was small and fragmented twisted metal, shredded wiring, almost nothing intact. But the most troubling discovery was the sudden and unexplained loss of both recorders. The United States National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, was invited to assist, as the Boeing 737 was an American-made aircraft. What followed was a tense and ultimately divided investigation. The NTSC concluded that they could not determine a cause. There was no evidence of mechanical failure, but also no direct proof of deliberate action. Their final report stopped short of saying why the aircraft had fallen. The NTSB, however, disagreed. After analyzing the physical evidence, flight characteristics, and power interruption to the recorders, the NTSB issued a letter to the NTSC, one that would become infamous in aviation history. In it, the American investigators stated that the only plausible explanation was that the descent had been intentionally initiated by the captain. They pointed to key evidence. Both recorders had been manually disabled, something that could only be done by pulling their circuit breakers. The descent profile showed that the aircraft had pitched nearly vertical, a maneuver consistent with deliberate control input, not structural failure. The engines remained at idle, and the dive continued unchecked until impact. The psychological background of Captain Su also became a focus. Investigators learned that he was under financial pressure, facing disciplinary action for unauthorized investments, and had taken out large insurance policies shortly before the crash. Colleagues described him as professional but distant in his final months. Still, without the recorder's final data, the conclusions remained circumstantial. The NTSC refused to label the event a suicide. The NTSB stood firm in its belief that it was. The divide between the two nations, Indonesia and the United States, mirrored that of EgyptAir Flight 990 2 years later. Politics, culture, and emotion collided with evidence and data. In Singapore, memorials were built for the victims. Families struggled not just with grief, but with the void left by uncertainty. "We just want to know what happened," one relative told reporters, "so we can sleep again." Over time, SilkAir 185 became a case study in aviation psychology, a reminder of how little we truly understand about the human element behind controls. Experts emphasize the need for better pilot mental health assessments and early intervention programs. Airlines quietly began to monitor cockpit crew behavior more closely, introducing confidential support systems for pilots facing personal or financial stress. The story of SilkAir Flight 185 is not one of clear answers. It is a story of shadows, of silence, and of the fine line between professionalism and despair. The Boeing 737, a symbol of reliability, fell from a clear blue sky. There were no storms, no failures, no warnings, only the sudden absence of sound, and a descent that began with the flick of a switch. In the years since, the crash has been dissected, debated, and doubted. But for those who lost loved ones, there is no need for theory or speculation. The truth they live with is simpler, that one ordinary flight, on one ordinary afternoon, became a mystery written in fragments of metal and unanswered questions. And so, SilkAir 185 remains a haunting chapter in aviation history, where silence, once again, became the loudest sound of all. November 29, 2013. A routine flight from Maputo, Mozambique to Luanda, Angola. LAM Mozambique Airlines Flight 470 was a modern Embraer 190, a small, reliable jet designed for regional routes. On board were 33 people, 27 passengers, and 6 crew members. It was supposed to be a quiet, 2-hour journey across southern Africa. The weather was clear, the aircraft in perfect condition, and the captain, Herminio dos Santos Fernandes, was an experienced pilot with over 9,000 flight hours. At first, everything seemed normal. The Embraer took off smoothly from Maputo's Mavalane Airport at 11:26 a.m., climbing to its assigned cruising altitude of 38,000 feet. Passengers read, chatted softly, or gazed out at the dry African landscape below. In the cockpit, calm professionalism. The first officer, Gerson Gonçalves, handled the radio calls. The captain made notes in his logbook. Then, somewhere over northern Namibia, just over halfway into the flight, the routine began to change. At 1:31 p.m., the captain told his first officer he was going to the restroom. As the first officer left the cockpit, The captain slid the reinforced door shut and locked it. It was the same kind of door installed on airliners worldwide after the attacks of 2001, a door built to keep danger out. But this time, it would do the opposite. Moments later, the aircraft's autopilot was reprogrammed. The altitude was reset from 38,000 feet down to 0. The throttles were reduced to idle, and the nose of the plane began to dip. At first, the descent was subtle, barely noticeable, but within seconds, it became steep, aggressive, controlled. The speed increased. Outside, passengers might have felt their stomachs lift as the cabin tilted forward. Flight attendants likely rushed toward the cockpit, realizing something was wrong. Behind the sealed door, they could not get in. The first officer returned, knocking firmly. No answer. He banged louder, shouting the captain's name. Then came the sound of fists on the metal door, followed by desperate pounding. Still nothing. Inside, the captain's breathing was steady. No distress calls, no words. At 1:34 p.m., just 6 minutes after the descent began, LAM Mozambique Airlines Flight 470 slammed into the remote Bwabwata National Park in Namibia. The impact created a crater 50 meters wide. There were no survivors. When investigators arrived at the crash site days later, they found wreckage scattered through the dense forest. The aircraft's black boxes were recovered and sent for analysis by the Directorate of Aircraft Accident Investigation of Namibia, the DAII. The final report was chillingly familiar. Flight data revealed that the descent had been initiated manually, from within the cockpit. There was no indication of mechanical malfunction, no sign of external interference, no evidence of system failure. Every action that led to the crash had been made by the captain himself. According to the cockpit voice recorder, the door had been locked from inside, and the altitude selector dialed to 0 just moments after the first officer left. The captain's breathing remained calm until impact. Investigators concluded that the crash was a deliberate act. The DAII's final report read, "The captain intentionally conducted the flight to the ground." It was a stark, devastating statement, and yet another reminder of the human fragility behind the glass and steel of modern aviation. For many, the tragedy of Flight 470 echoed the earlier disaster of Germanwings Flight 9525 in Europe. The same pattern, the same silence, the same locked door. Airline psychologists later discovered that Captain Fernandez had recently suffered a personal loss, the death of his young son. Colleagues described him as quiet and withdrawn in the days before the flight. He had spoken little to anyone during the pre-flight briefing. No one had noticed anything alarming, no sign that something so irreversible was about to happen. The Namibia report highlighted a painful truth. Even with decades of safety advancements, advanced autopilot systems, and strict psychological screenings, the human element remains the most unpredictable variable in aviation. After the crash, Mozambique Airlines implemented new safety measures, mandatory cockpit pairing, regular psychological evaluations, and random check-ins on pilot well-being. But these changes came too late for the 33 people who vanished that day. The story of LAM Flight 470 is one of quiet tragedy, an echo of the same question that haunts every aviation investigator. How do you prevent what cannot be predicted? As the world stared at the images of the shattered Embraer in the Namibian wilderness, aviation experts across continents saw a pattern, forming a pattern that linked distant tragedies by one common thread: isolation inside the cockpit. And once again, the door that was meant to protect became the one thing that sealed everyone's fate. May 31st, 2009. Just before sunset, Air France Flight 447 lifted off from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, bound for Paris. It was an overnight flight, a familiar route across the Atlantic, flown countless times by Airbus A330 jets. On board were 228 people from 32 different countries, business travelers, families, newlyweds, and a crew that had made this journey many times before. The flight's captain, Marc Dubois, was a veteran pilot with more than 11,000 hours of experience. That night, he was joined by two co-pilots, David Robert and Pierre-Cédric Bonan, as part of a rotating crew, allowing for rest during the long transoceanic flight. The weather reports were typical for the equatorial zone, some storms along the intertropical convergence zone, an area known for turbulence and unpredictable weather. Nothing unusual. At 10:29 p.m. local time, the Airbus climbed through 35,000 feet, entering a thick layer of clouds. Lightning flashed in the distance. On the cockpit voice recorder, you can hear the pilots discussing a change in the weather radar settings. It's calm, professional, even casual. Then, minutes later, the aircraft passes into a storm cell, and the story of Air France 447 begins to shift. At 2:10 a.m. Universal Time, the pitot tubes, small sensors on the aircraft's exterior that measure airspeed, suddenly iced over. Within seconds, the readings they sent to the flight computers became unreliable. The autopilot disengaged automatically, handing full control back to the pilots. A simple caution sounded. Autopilot off. What happened next unfolded in just over 4 minutes. 4 minutes that changed how the world understood modern flight. With the autopilot disconnected, the junior co-pilot, Bonin, took manual control. Confused by the loss of airspeed indications and turbulence shaking the jet, he pulled back slightly on the control stick. The nose of the aircraft rose, the angle of attack increased, and the airspeed, already inconsistent due to the iced sensors, began to drop. The aircraft entered a climb, reaching 38,000 feet, then stalled. A stall, in aviation, doesn't mean the engines have stopped. It means the wings are no longer generating enough lift to stay airborne. Recovery requires lowering the nose to regain speed. But in the darkness, over a moonless ocean, with warning alarms screaming, the pilots misread the situation. The cockpit voice recorder captures confusion. "What's happening?" one asks. "We've lost the speeds," another replies. "Alternate law. I don't understand what's going on." In the background, the stall warning repeats over and over. "Stall! Stall!" Bonin continues to pull back, lifting the nose higher. The aircraft climbs, slows, and then begins to fall. A giant, silent drop from the sky. The captain, awakened from his rest break, returns to the cockpit. "What's happening?" he asks. The answer comes, "We've lost control of the plane." For the next 3 minutes, the Airbus A330 descends through the night. Not in a spin, not tumbling, but in a stable aerodynamic stall. Its nose high, engines running, wings generating almost no lift. The altimeter ticks downward. 30,000 feet, 20,000, 10,000. The crew continues to pull back on the controls, believing they are in a dive, when in reality, the aircraft's nose is too high to recover. At 2:14 a.m., the flight data recorder captured its final entry. The aircraft was descending through 10,000 feet at a vertical speed of 10,000 feet per minute. The last words on the cockpit recording are haunting in their simplicity. "Damn it, we're going to crash. This can't be true." Seconds later, Air France Flight 447 struck the Atlantic Ocean. There were no survivors. The search for the wreckage became one of the most complex recovery operations in aviation history. The main debris field was not located until 2011, nearly 2 years later, when deep-sea robots found the fuselage resting 3,000 meters below the surface. When investigators from France's BEA analyzed the flight recorders, they found no evidence of mechanical failure. The engines were functioning. The flight control systems were responding. The tragedy, as it turned out, was rooted in confusion and human perception. The official BEA report revealed a cascade of small, understandable mistakes, pilots reacting to conflicting data, the absence of clear training for high-altitude manual flight, and the natural human instinct to pull up when something feels wrong. In that storm, surrounded by darkness and alarms, even experienced aviators found themselves caught in an illusion. The lessons from Flight 447 reshaped aviation training worldwide. Airlines introduced new simulator programs, focusing on manual flight at high altitudes and stall recovery under stress. The industry recognized a growing problem automation dependency. Pilots were increasingly skilled at managing systems, but less accustomed to raw, manual flying in unexpected situations. The crash of Air France 447 was not about incompetence. It was about the complexity of human cognition under pressure, how quickly confidence can turn into confusion, and how even highly trained professionals can become lost in the interface between man and machine. In the years that followed, families of the victims formed associations, pushing for answers, accountability, and reform. They turned grief into advocacy, ensuring that what happened over the Atlantic that night would lead to progress. When the final report was released, it ended with a line that still echoes through aviation training centers. Understanding the plane is not enough. One must also understand the human who flies it. That, perhaps, is the truest legacy of Air France Flight 447, a tragedy that reminded the world that behind every cockpit full of lights and screens, there are still hearts, instincts, and hands all as fragile as the skies they navigate. It was the evening of April 26, 1994. Japan's Nagoya airport was calm, illuminated by soft yellow runway lights reflecting off a light drizzle. China Airlines Flight 140, an Airbus A300, was on final approach after a routine flight from Taipei, Taiwan. On board were 256 passengers and crew, families returning home, business travelers, students, and a cockpit crew that had already flown several legs that day. The captain, 32-year-old Ren Shi-lin, was experienced but young for a commander. His first officer, Chiu Ming, was equally capable, though slightly less seasoned. The Airbus A300 was among the most technologically advanced aircraft of its time, a product of the new fly-by-wire era, where computers assisted nearly every phase of flight. But on that rainy night, those very systems and the subtle ways they interacted with human behavior would create one of the most haunting tragedies in Asian aviation history. At 8:52 p.m., as the aircraft approached runway 34, everything seemed normal. The crew received clearance to land, descending steadily through 2,000 feet. Inside the cockpit, both pilots prepared for touchdown. The aircraft was stable, properly aligned, and within all approach parameters. Then, something small, something barely noticeable, changed everything. As the plane neared the runway, the first officer accidentally activated the go-around mode, a function designed to help pilots abort a landing and climb away safely if something looked wrong. The system automatically advanced the throttles and raised the nose slightly, assuming the crew intended to climb. But the crew didn't want to go around. They wanted to land. Surprised by the sudden thrust increase, the captain instinctively pulled back the throttles to idle, trying to regain manual control. Yet the flight control computer, still in go-around mode, began to fight back, maintaining the climb command that had been triggered seconds earlier. What followed was a deadly tug-of-war between man and machine. As the captain pushed the nose down, the autopilot trimmed the aircraft nose up. As the engine spooled down, the flight computer continued to believe the aircraft was climbing and kept adjusting accordingly. Within moments, the Airbus entered a dangerous flight configuration. Its nose pitched too high, airspeed dropping rapidly. "Go around," one pilot shouted. "No, land," the other replied. Their voices overlapped in rising panic. The airplane began to stall. The warning sounded, "Stall! Stall!" Passengers would have felt the jet lurch upward, engines roaring briefly, followed by an eerie sensation of weightlessness as it began to fall. The lights inside the cabin flickered. In the cockpit, confusion and disbelief filled the final seconds. The pilots pulled desperately at the controls, unaware that the automation system was trimming against them, commanding the exact opposite of what they intended. At 8:57 p.m., China Airlines Flight 140 slammed into the ground, just short of Nagoya's runway, exploding into a fireball visible for miles. Only 7 people survived. 264 lives were lost. The investigation that followed was one of the most detailed ever conducted by Japan's Aircraft Accident Investigation Commission, later summarized in the Japan Transport Safety Board's final report. The findings revealed no mechanical defect, only a chain of automation, confusion, and human misunderstanding. The Airbus's autopilot logic, though technically correct, had not been designed to handle such conflicting human inputs during landing. Once go-around mode was engaged, it could not be easily overridden unless disengaged entirely. The pilots, meanwhile, believed they were manually controlling the aircraft, unaware that the computer was subtly countering every move. It was a deadly lesson in what investigators later called automation surprise, when the aircraft's logic diverges from human expectation, often in ways that are invisible until it's too late. In response, Airbus issued new procedures and training modules, emphasizing clear disengagement of go-around mode before manual corrections. Airlines around the world began revising training for mode awareness, the understanding of what the airplane's automation is doing at all times. For pilots, the crash of Flight 140 became a haunting reminder. Technology is a tool, not a partner. Even the most advanced systems cannot replace clear human understanding. In Nagoya, a quiet memorial stands today near the airport. Engraved on its stone surface are the names of every passenger and crew member, a symbol of both grief and learning. Every time a modern pilot trains for automation failures or mode confusion, every time they are reminded to know what the airplane is doing, it is partly because of what happened that April night in 1994. The tragedy of China Airlines Flight 140 is not just about a mistake. It's about the invisible line between human control and machine logic, a line that aviation continues to walk to this day. It was March 23, 1994. Aeroflot Flight 593 departed from Moscow, bound for Hong Kong, a 10-hour journey across Siberia and China. The aircraft was an Airbus A310, one of the first Western jets operated by the Russian national airline. For Aeroflot, it symbolized modernization, a leap toward the digital era of aviation. For the passengers on board, it was simply another overnight flight eastward. There were 75 souls aboard, 63 passengers, 12 crew members, and one of them was not supposed to be anywhere near the cockpit controls. At the controls sat Captain Yaroslav Kudrinsky, a respected pilot with over 10,000 flight hours. He was joined by co-pilot Igor Piskaryov and relief pilot Andrei Danilov. Kudrinsky was proud of his job, proud of flying one of Russia's newest, most advanced aircraft. And on this particular flight, he had brought along two special guests, his teenage children, Yana and Eldar. As the aircraft cruised high above the mountains of southern Siberia, the atmosphere in the cockpit was relaxed. The autopilot maintained the course. The crew chatted and shared coffee. Around that time, Captain Kudrinsky invited his children into the cockpit, something that, at the time, was not entirely unheard of, though still against regulations. First, his 15-year-old daughter, Yana, sat in the left-hand seat. She touched the controls gently, smiling nervously as her father reassured her. "It's okay," he said. "The autopilot is flying the plane." And indeed, it was the Airbus's systems quietly maintaining its altitude and heading. After a few minutes, she returned to the observer's seat. Then, Kudrinsky's 16-year-old son Eldar took her place. Curious and excited, he placed his hands on the control column. His father, perhaps proud, perhaps wanting to show him how it all worked, allowed it. What happened next would become one of the most tragic examples of misunderstanding modern flight automation. Eldar gently turned the control stick to the right just slightly. The aircraft began a slow roll. The autopilot countered, keeping the wings level. Everything seemed fine. But Eldar, feeling little response, turned it further. The autopilot again resisted, but this time only partially. Unknown to anyone in the cockpit, the system had reached its limit in compensating for manual input. One part of the autopilot disengaged, transferring partial control of the ailerons to manual mode. A small amber warning illuminated quietly on the flight panel, control wheel steering. No audible alarm, no verbal warning. In the darkened cockpit, the crew didn't notice. Within seconds, the Airbus began rolling further to the right. The horizon outside tilted, and the altimeter needle began to move. Co-pilot Piskaryov suddenly noticed the change. "What's happening?" he asked. Kudrinsky replied calmly, "It's okay. The autopilot will correct it." But the autopilot no longer could. The plane was now in a steep rightward bank, 40 degrees, 60, 70. The nose began to drop. The co-pilot grabbed the controls and shouted, "We're turning!" Kudrinsky leaned forward, realizing too late that they were in serious trouble. The cockpit voice recorder captures the moment chaos replaced calm. The captain's voice turned urgent. "My controls! My controls!" He pulled back sharply, trying to level the wings. But in doing so, he inadvertently increased the aircraft's angle of attack. The Airbus climbed briefly, then stalled. The stall warning sounded. Stall. Stall. The aircraft rolled left, then right, pitching violently. The cabin lights flickered as passengers screamed. In just 45 seconds, Flight 593 plunged from 33,000 feet. At 14 minutes past midnight, it slammed into a mountainside in the remote Mezhdoryechensky region of Siberia. There were no survivors. When investigators reached the wreckage, they were initially baffled. The aircraft's engines and systems had been functioning perfectly before impact. There was no sign of structural failure or explosion. Only after retrieving the flight recorders did the truth emerge, a chain of small, human decisions that built into catastrophe. The investigation revealed that the autopilot had been partially disengaged by manual input, without the pilots realizing it. The Airbus's automation system had been misunderstood, designed for Western cockpit procedures that Russian pilots had not fully trained on. The system did exactly what it was supposed to do. It was the crew's interpretation that went wrong. When the official report was released, it stated plainly, the crash was the result of pilot error, caused by unintentional disengagement of autopilot controls during unauthorized presence in the cockpit. The story sent shockwaves through the aviation world. Airbus and Aeroflot responded by revising training materials to ensure pilots clearly understood mode transitions, when automation was active and when it wasn't. Cockpit visits were permanently banned during flight. For years, the crash of Aeroflot Flight 593 was whispered about among pilots not out of ridicule, but out of fear. It showed how quickly a moment of human pride could become a tragedy when trust in automation replaced understanding of it. The mountains where the plane went down are still remote, covered in snow most of the year. Local villagers say that sometimes, when fog rolls down from the peaks, they can still hear the faint echo of engines, a story passed down quietly, as if to remind us that even in the safest machines, human curiosity can still be the most dangerous force. It was February 6th, 1996, a warm, still night in the Dominican Republic. The lights of Puerto Plata shimmered in the distance as Birgenair Flight 301 prepared for takeoff. The aircraft was a Boeing 757, one of the most advanced commercial airliners of its time, operated by the Turkish charter airline Birgenair. On board were 189 people, mostly German tourists, returning home after tropical holidays, and a crew of experienced Turkish aviators. At 10:42 p.m., the aircraft began its takeoff roll down runway 8. The engines roared to full power, and the plane lifted into the humid Caribbean night, climbing steadily over the dark Atlantic waters. Everything appeared normal. The captain, Ahmet Erdem, sat in command, a seasoned pilot with nearly 24,000 hours of flight experience. His first officer, Aykut Gürgen, and flight engineer Erkan Erdem worked efficiently beside him. But unknown to anyone on board, a silent flaw had already set the tragedy in motion, one so small that it could fit inside the palm of your hand. During the aircraft's time on the ground, one of the 3 pitot tubes, the small metal probes that measure airspeed, had become blocked, most likely by a wasp nest. The Boeing 757 had been sitting unused for over 20 days, and these insects, drawn to the narrow cavities of the pitot system, had made one their home. As the aircraft accelerated for takeoff, the blocked pitot tube fed incorrect data to the captain's airspeed indicator. The left side display, the one used by Captain Erdem, began showing speeds higher than they actually were. The first officer's instruments on the right side, unaffected, displayed the correct speed, but the difference was subtle, easy to miss in the rush of departure. Minutes after takeoff, as the aircraft climbed through 7,000 feet, confusion set in. The captain's airspeed indicator suddenly read over 300 knots, dangerously high, while the co-pilots showed only 200. The overspeed warning sounded, a loud, repetitive horn meant to alert pilots of excessive speed. The captain, trusting his instruments, pulled back on the throttles. The first officer, seeing his own lower readings, hesitated. "Captain, my speed is different," he said. But by then, the autopilot, receiving contradictory signals, disconnected. Now hand-flying the plane, the captain reduced thrust even further, believing the aircraft was still accelerating too fast. The Boeing began to lose speed. Within seconds, the stall warning sounded. "Stall, stall." The cockpit voice recorder captures the confusion. Two highly trained pilots confronted with two opposing truths. "We are over speed," the captain shouted. "No, no, we are too slow," replied the first officer. The stick shaker vibrated violently, warning of an imminent stall. Yet the contradictory data made it impossible to know which alarm was real. For 35 chaotic seconds, the pilots tried to interpret their instruments, unaware that one of them was lying. The aircraft's nose pitched upward, the engines throttled down, altitude dropped sharply. At 10:47 p.m., just 5 minutes after takeoff, Birgenair Flight 301 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean, 26 kilometers north of Puerto Plata. All 189 people on board were killed. When recovery teams located the wreckage, investigators quickly focused on the pitot static system. The captain's pitot tube was found completely blocked, sealed by a hardened substance, later confirmed to be the remains of an insect nest. It was a simple, almost absurd cause, one that had doomed an entire aircraft. The final report, issued by the Dominican Republic's Aviation Authority, with support from the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, painted a tragic picture of human reliance on technology. The blocked pitot tube created conflicting information. The autopilot and flight computers reacted as designed, but the pilots, overwhelmed by conflicting warnings, were unable to diagnose the root cause in time. The tragedy led to major changes in aircraft maintenance and storage protocols worldwide. Airlines began mandating pitot covers whenever aircraft were parked for extended periods, and pre-flight inspections were expanded to include detailed checks of all flight sensors. For pilots, the lesson was clear. No matter how modern the airplane, no matter how advanced the systems, everything still depends on something as fragile as a single tube of air. In aviation training centers today, simulator scenarios based on Birgenair Flight 301 are still used to teach instrument cross-checking, the process of verifying readings against multiple sources, not trusting one indicator alone. The ocean floor north of Puerto Plata remains the final resting place of Flight 301, a silent warning beneath the waves. A reminder that sometimes tragedy begins not with a storm or an explosion, but with something so small, so ordinary, that it's invisible until it's too late. It was the night of February 12, 2009. The winter cold had settled deep over the northeastern United States. Snow drifted across the runways of Newark Liberty International Airport as Colgan Air Flight 3407, operating as Continental Connection, prepared for its short evening journey to Buffalo, New York. On board were 49 people, 45 passengers, 2 pilots, and 2 flight attendants. It was a routine commuter flight, one of hundreds that linked small cities across America every night. At the controls sat Captain Marvin Renslow and First Officer Rebecca Shaw. They were flying a Bombardier Dash 8Q400, a twin-engine turboprop known for its reliability, but also for its sensitivity in icy conditions. For both pilots, the night represented another long shift in a demanding schedule. Renslow, in his late 40s, was a former flight instructor, quiet and composed. Shaw, just 24, was still building her experience, ambitious, hard-working, but exhausted from constant commuting and irregular rest. As the aircraft climbed into the dark, wintry sky, everything seemed normal. The cabin lights dimmed, the engines hummed. But above the clouds, a layer of freezing mist awaited, invisible, silent, and deadly. At 10:17 p.m., Flight 3407 was cruising at 16,000 feet. Ice began to form on the wings and tail, a common occurrence in such weather, and one the aircraft's de-icing systems were designed to handle. The pilots activated the anti-ice equipment and began their descent toward Buffalo. The control tower cleared them for approach. But as they descended through 3,000 feet, something subtle, something almost imperceptible, began to go wrong. On the flight data recorder, the airspeed showed a steady 134 knots. Then, suddenly, it dropped. The autopilot, detecting the loss of lift, adjusted the pitch slightly upward, but instead of disconnecting and flying manually, as training recommended in icing conditions, the captain left the autopilot engaged. The plane slowed further. Then, without warning, a warning horn blared in the cockpit. Stick shaker. Stall. Stall. The Dash 8 was approaching an aerodynamic stall, the point where its wings could no longer generate lift. Proper recovery required lowering the nose to regain speed. But in those few seconds of shock and confusion, instinct took over. The captain pulled back sharply on the control column, raising the nose further. The aircraft bucked violently. The engines roared as the captain added power, but it was too late. The nose pitched up 40 degrees, then down 45. Alarms screamed as the plane rolled and yawed uncontrollably. In the cabin, passengers would have felt a sudden weightlessness, followed by a violent downward lurch. Coffee cups and belongings flew into the air. Within seconds, the airplane plummeted from 2,000 feet. At 10:20 p.m., Colgan Air Flight 3407 slammed into a suburban house in Clarence Center, New York. The impact and fire destroyed the home instantly. All 49 people on board and 1 person on the ground were killed. When investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board arrived, they found that the aircraft systems had been working properly. The engines were running. The de-icing systems were functioning. The cause lay not in the airplane, but in the cockpit. The NTSB report revealed a devastating truth. Both pilots had reacted incorrectly to the stall warning. The captain's pullback on the controls, combined with the first officer's deployment of flaps at the wrong time, sealed the aircraft's fate. Fatigue and stress were key contributing factors. Captain Renslow had slept less than 5 hours in the previous 36. First Officer Shaw had commuted overnight from Seattle, sleeping in the crew lounge before her shift. Their exhaustion, combined with startle and confusion, led to catastrophic decisions. The tragedy forced the U.S. aviation industry to confront a growing problem: the gap between regional airlines and their larger counterparts. Colgan Air, like many small carriers, paid its pilots far less and demanded brutal schedules. Training standards were minimal compared to major airlines. Public outrage was immense. Families of the victims formed the Flight 3407 Families Association and fought for years to reform aviation safety laws. Their persistence led to the Airline Safety and Federal Aviation Administration Extension Act of 2010, which raised training requirements for all U.S. airline pilots and imposed stricter rest and qualification rules. Today, every commercial pilot in the United States must hold an airline transport pilot certificate, requiring at least 1,500 flight hours, advanced simulator training, and recurrent testing on stall recovery. These reforms exist because of what happened on that cold February night. The house in Clarence Center was rebuilt, and a small memorial now stands nearby. Each year, local residents and families of the victims gather there, reading the names of those lost. For them, it isn't just about the past. It's about ensuring that fatigue, complacency, and human error never again conspire to bring an aircraft out of the sky. Colgan Air Flight 3407 was not brought down by weather or by machines. It was brought down by exhaustion, a quiet, invisible danger that still haunts aviation today. It was February 23, 2019, a routine cargo flight that would become one of the most haunting reminders that even in the era of digital cockpits, human error remains the final frontier of aviation safety. Atlas Air Flight 3591 was operating on behalf of Amazon Prime Air, carrying packages and 3 crew members from Miami, Florida to Houston, Texas. The aircraft was a Boeing 767, a workhorse of modern cargo transport, built to withstand the harshest conditions and controlled by some of the most sophisticated automation in the world. That afternoon, skies over Texas were rough. A line of storm clouds stretched across the Gulf Coast, bringing turbulence, wind shear, and shifting cloud layers. For the Atlas crew, it was just another challenge in an otherwise ordinary day. The captain, a 44-year-old veteran, sat in the left seat. To his right was First Officer Conrad Aska, a pilot with over 5,000 hours of experience, but limited exposure to the Boeing 767. Behind them sat a jump seat rider, a pilot from another airline, quietly observing. At 1:35 p.m., Flight 359, one was descending through 6,000 feet, approaching the Houston area. Air traffic control instructed the crew to reduce speed and prepare for a new approach vector. The weather radar showed turbulence ahead, but nothing alarming. The cockpit was calm, voices steady, professional. Then, in the span of 3 seconds, everything changed. The aircraft suddenly pitched nose down violently, sharply as if yanked by an invisible hand. Within seconds, the Boeing was in a near vertical dive, plummeting toward the muddy marshlands of Trinity Bay at more than 430 knots. There were no distress calls, no mayday, no time to react. At 1:39 p.m., Atlas Air Flight 3591 slammed into the bay with such force that it disintegrated instantly. The impact scattered debris across 2 miles of shallow water. All 3 men aboard were killed. When the first recovery crews arrived, they found fragments of packages, twisted metal, and personal items floating in the murky water. The event seemed inexplicable. No weather severe enough to cause structural failure, no indication of explosion, and no distress communication from the cockpit. The investigation fell to the National Transportation Safety Board, and what they uncovered was as tragic as it was baffling. Data from the flight recorders showed that the first officer had accidentally activated the go-around mode, a setting designed to increase power and pitch during aborted landings while descending through the turbulent clouds. Startled by the sudden pitch-up, he pushed forward aggressively on the control column, believing the aircraft was pitching too high. But in doing so, he overrode the automation and commanded a nose-down input. The Boeing responded immediately, its engines still producing full thrust from the go-around command, now combined with a steep downward pitch. The result was catastrophic, a controlled, full-power dive straight toward the Earth. For nearly 30 seconds, the captain and jump seat pilot tried to recover. The captain shouted, "Pull up! Pull up!" But the first officer, panicking, continued to push forward, convinced that the aircraft was climbing uncontrollably. His brain, overwhelmed by a phenomenon called somatogravic illusion, told him that the acceleration he felt was a climb, when in fact, the plane was descending at hundreds of feet per second. The NTSB report described those seconds as a perfect storm of human factors: misperception, panic, and a breakdown of cockpit coordination. The captain never realized that his co-pilot had input a nose-down command. The aircraft's warning systems, overspeed, terrain, and pull-up alerts sounded simultaneously, adding to the chaos. In the end, they ran out of altitude before they could regain control. The board's conclusion was blunt. The first officer's inappropriate response to inadvertent activation of the go-around mode, combined with spatial disorientation, led to the loss of control. But deeper than that line of technical jargon lay something profoundly human. Despite decades of safety advancements, the mind of a pilot, even a trained one, can still be betrayed by instinct, fear, and the overwhelming sensations of flight. The NTSB also discovered that the first officer had a history of poor performance in simulators, including repeated failures during upset recovery training. In earlier jobs, evaluators had described him as easily startled and prone to overreacting under stress. Yet, due to gaps in data sharing between airlines, Atlas Air had no record of this when he was hired. The tragedy led to immediate calls for reform. The FAA began strengthening pilot record databases to ensure that training deficiencies would follow pilots between employers. Airlines also expanded simulator programs to include more emphasis on spatial disorientation, teaching pilots to recognize when their senses deceive them. For aviation psychologists, Atlas Air Flight 3591 was another example of automation mismanagement, when pilots accustomed to trusting systems find themselves overwhelmed the moment those systems behave unexpectedly. In many ways, the crash of Flight 3591 was the 21st century's version of Air France Flight 447. A stark reminder that technology can't replace perception, and perception can't always be trusted. Today, at the edge of Trinity Bay, a small memorial stands for the 3 men who lost their lives that day. The water there is calm, silent, giving no hint of the violence that unfolded above it. Fishermen sometimes see the faint glint of metal in the mud below, remnants of the aircraft that fell so suddenly from the clouds. In the official summary of the investigation, one line stands out above all others. Even in modern aviation, where automation shields us from error, the greatest variable remains the human mind. And so Flight 3591 became more than a story of a crash. It became a reflection of aviation itself. A world built on precision and progress, yet forever bound to the fragile instincts of those who fly within it.